The Trump administration is changing global politics, and it's using trade and different deals as a tool to do it. Now, as these policies come into effect, we're seeing its impact on a global, really global scale. The United Nations World Health Organization, which is cutting jobs and slashing their budgets and seeing severe disruptions because of this. And the Trump administration is also now restricting taxpayer money from going to organizations that are holding on to issues like DEI, globally even, not even just in the U.S., including in like France and Australia. And meanwhile, as all this happens, the U.S. is also demanding free speech in Europe, the new global trend of pushing American values. I'll be talking about these topics and more today. Let's jump into it. Now, first of all, through the use of tariffs, foreign aid, renegotiated trade deals, the Trump administration is forcing a change in politics all around the world. The latest has been the trade war that's taken center stage between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party. But alongside this, there are new U.S. trade politics that require global changes on identity politics. There's a new push for other countries to drop forms of online censorship. And when taken all together, the policies represent a new form of American diplomacy using financial power as its tool. Now, on this, a key part is the campaign. It's impacting groups that until very recently represented a type of globalist government. Now, part of this is the World Health Organization, the WHO, under the United Nations. And over the last few years, it was looking like the WHO would get a global pandemic treaty. Do you remember that? That would grant it significant influence globally to manage health crisis, including pressuring other countries, including the United States. But now the organization is, let's say, struggling to get by. This is the United Nations itself. It says recent funding cuts have caused severe disruptions to health services in almost 3/4 of all countries. Which country then was basically propping up the health policies of 3/4 of all countries? Well, here's what it says. Speaking on Thursday at a press conference in Geneva, Tedros said that in around 25% of countries, some health facilities have had to close completely due to cuts, according to figures from more than 100 countries compiled by WHO. It says this: out-of-pocket payments for health services had led to disruptions to the supply of medicines and other health products, as well as rising job losses in the healthcare sector. As a result, quote, countries are revising budgets, cutting costs, and strengthening fundraising and partnerships, said the UN Health Agency chief. So where did all that money come from? What's making it so all these countries don't have those health policies, right? Well, a lot of that was because Donald Trump and his administration began cutting U.S. funding to it. Now, this happened during Trump's flurry of executive orders on his first day of office. And watch this, folks.
Withdrawing from the World Health Organization, sir?
Ooh, that's a big one. So we paid $500 million to World Health when I was here, and I terminated it. China, with 1.4 billion people, we have 350. China pays 39 million, and we pay 500 million. And China's a bigger country.
And now, well, the aftermath of the U.S. withdrawal is becoming clearer. The WHO is cutting jobs and slashing their budgets now. Reuters said this. The World Health Organization, WHO, is proposing to reduce staff numbers and the scale of its work as it slashes its budget by just over 1/5 due to the impact of U.S. funding cuts, according to an internal memo seen by Reuters. It says the U.S. is by far the UN Health Agency's biggest financial backer, contributing around 18% of its overall funding. And they say, quote, the United States' announcement, combined with recent reductions in official development assistance by some countries to fund increased defense spending, has made our situation much more acute, stated the WHO memo, which was dated March 28th and signed by WHO's Director General Tedros. And it says the U.S. withdrawal has exacerbated a funding crisis due to member states reducing their development spending, faced with an income gap of nearly $600 million this year. The WHO has proposed to slash its budget for 2026 to 2027 by 21%, which is about what the U.S. cut, by the way. from US 5.3 billion to US 4.2 billion, according to the memo. So it's important to note, it's not only just the US spending less, it's also that the US is making like Europe pay their fair share in defense, trying to, and that's cutting their ability to give it more money as well. Now, Trump did suggest if we can work out a better deal, there is a chance he might renegotiate with the World Health Organization. But remember, when he pulled the United States out of the WHO during his first term in office, it was because the United Nations agency was not able to demonstrate its independence from communist China. And also, look, even with the funding cuts, the World Health Organization is not dropping its other initiatives. For example, its push for the pandemic treaty is still underway. They're still pushing for it. Politico just said this, by the way. It says World Health Organization members will reconvene on Tuesday, just recently, to finalize a deal on sharing life-saving technology with developing countries as part of a new pandemic agreement, after all-night talks brought them within striking distance of an accord. It says the WHO members have reached an agreement in principle over how to tackle future pandemics. After 3 years of discussions, the co-chair of the negotiating body told the agency France Press on Saturday. And according to the latest draft of the proposed pact obtained by Politico, most of the text is now agreed, meaning they're going to do it. It says still to be signed off on is contentious language covering the sharing of technology for pandemic-related products such as drugs, vaccines, and therapeutics. Developing countries have pushed for a strong language that will ensure they are able to scale up production in their own regions rather than waiting in line for critical technologies. Now look, in terms of the broader picture of what Trump's spending cuts and withdrawals and elimination programs, what this actually does, the U.S. withdrawal from the WHO is just one piece of this. There's a lot of other stuff. The actions to significantly cut programs under USAID, those got a lot of attention. A lot of people paid attention to that. But there were similar ones to that, similar organizations and spending that were also cut and that were being used for similar ways, right? For example, there was USIP, that's the U.S. Institute of Peace. Have you heard of that? Well, that organization has now been severely impacted. Washington Examiner said this: the Trump administration fired nearly the entire staff of the U.S. Institute of Peace headquarters in Washington, D.C. on Friday, according to multiple reports. It says the mass firings in what anonymous employees characterized as a Friday night massacre to the Washington Post affected somewhere between 200 and 300 employees at the nonprofit organization, all of whom were offered severance packages and 1 month of health insurance if they waived their right to sue the Institute. Now, look, what is this? Well, the USIP was created by Congress. It's a U.S.-funded think tank. It also allegedly works to prevent and resolve global conflicts. It's framed by a lot of critics as basically a color revolution organization. The Trump administration alleges that its goal to stop all these conflicts has not been met. And so the idea is, well, why are we keeping it? And it's now facing some reshuffling and investigations from the Doge Department because of that. And it's not even just there. There are a lot of other organizations, other programs, funding channels, other issues that all help to fund and support global initiatives which tend to be very politically divisive. They tended to help people on the left, maybe the far left. Among these, Planned Parenthood. There is a very large legal battle right now going on over the Planned Parenthood funding. And this is particularly around whether or not it can use Medicaid to help run its operations, taxpayer-funded money. And the implications from a looming Supreme Court ruling on this could likewise have some big ripple effects through the entire medical system. The Epoch Times said at the heart of the case is the question of whether federal law unambiguously bestows Medicaid patients with the right to choose a specific provider. Planned Parenthood and the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals says it does. But the state of South Carolina, which bars taxpayer funding of abortion, meaning the state can ban it, but people can use Medicaid to pay for it still, says the law empowers states to decide which providers are qualified for Medicaid funding, like if they ban a certain organization. And notice that South Carolina has asked the Supreme Court to step in, and depending on how it's decided, the case could deal a potentially fatal blow to Planned Parenthood or set back widespread efforts to defund the organization once and for all. It says the case was prompted by South Carolina Governor Henry McMaster's 2018 directive ordering the state's health department to terminate all abortion providers from the Medicaid program. The order deemed all abortion clinics to be unqualified to provide family planning services. Planned Parenthood South Atlantic and one of the affiliate's Medicaid patients swiftly filed a federal lawsuit challenging the order. It says at issue is a provision of the Social Security Amendments of 1965, also called the Medicare and Medicaid Act. The statute requires state Medicaid plans to, quote, provide that any individual eligible for medical assistance may obtain such assistance from any provider qualified to perform the service or services required. Meaning, well, they may ban abortion or restrict it in a certain state, but if Planned Parenthood does it, or for example, if they restrict taxpayer money from going to it, Planned Parenthood works as the workaround for it. It says who undertakes to provide him such services. Now look, that story is going to change a lot depending on who you're talking to, but basically it allows states to deny Medicaid funding for select organizations, Planned Parenthood in this case. And that would mean if people are on Medicaid, a state could restrict them from using abortion services. There's no way around it. For example, with Planned Parenthood as a state-funded service. And that would also cut very deeply into the organization's finances. The scissors are reaching up to it, right? Now, part of the argument for that is religious. A lot of Americans have a religious dispute with abortion. And it goes into whether they believe there's a human soul or not, right? And if this violates somebody's religion, they probably don't want their tax dollars being used for it either, because you're forced to pay taxes. Would you want your tax dollars being used for something that goes against your religious beliefs? But the other side is that Planned Parenthood isn't just an abortion service. It also does a lot with political financing. It's engaged very deeply in social activism. It's an education system that tends to be on the very far left hand of politics. So there's also a question about using taxpayer dollars for partisan and politically active organizations. Should we be funding an organization that basically exists on the far left of politics and tries to advance that? That's also the question. And that also ties into the broader picture of what we're watching now unfold. Many organizations that are now losing money, whether it's through USAID or having their budgets cut or people fired, many of them are politically active organizations, especially toward the far left of politics. And look, even those that were not, well, there were accusations they were in turn giving money to deeply partisan organizations and movements. There was like a kind of a tree structure, right? Different branches, and the branches were growing the fruits of like far left groups and so on. And even with some of the major agencies, the concerns over politically partisan funding, using your tax dollars for what are just politically activist organizations, is becoming the backdrop of a lot of the investigations and spending cuts we're now watching from the Trump administration. Now, part of this ties into what are now being described as patronage networks. Patronage networks, right? Daily Signal said this: President Donald Trump has launched a political counter-revolution in the early days of his second presidency. One of the most profound ways he's doing this is by effectively cutting off the left's massive government-funded patronage networks. What's making Trump's move so effective is that many of these networks are based on government functions that long ago either waned in usefulness or have completely abandoned their purpose. And they say that's what freezing U.S. Agency for International Development funding was partly about. Foreign aid is already deeply unpopular with the American people, but what are we spending money on is just generic aid to potential international partners. Now look, the story points to a few different areas. One of them, just as one of many examples, is the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. Now look, on one side, the EPA help create regulations and oversight to protect American water and natural resources, basically making sure we're not messing up the environment, right? But the issue that's now being raised, since environmentalism was turned into a deeply partisan issue mainly because of agendas like ESG, environmental and social governance, well, some of its programs also became painted in the light of these political issues. And this is actually being raised by the new EPA administrator himself. Lee Zeldin, the head of the EPA under Trump, spoke about this problem with Matt Gaetz on One American News. Watch this.
The EPA was absolutely being used to push out this green slush fund to their friends. By design, the director of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund leaves one of these NGOs, goes to work at the Biden administration to design this whole setup, and then sees his former employer get $5 billion. I mean, we've seen it on the smaller grants as well. What one person who is a CEO of a nonprofit was serving on the White House Environmental Justice Council, applied for $20 million, got it, even though they only received just over $2 million over the course of the prior 3 years. So again, the more you dig into this, the more you realize that this was a green slush fund that was going to left-wing activist groups rather than going directly towards remediating environmental issues. So to the heart.
Now, of course, the narrative is going to be different if you hear it from the other side. They'd say the cross-pollination of people between government positions and other groups, well, it's because they have the skills, they have the knowledge, the expertise, and so on. And also, look, environmental and social governance, ESG, that was a huge focus politically under the Biden administration. And effectively what that meant was this: programs for that, ESG, were implemented throughout the entire government, all the government agencies alongside DEI. So obviously the EPA, which is focused on the environment, was deeply involved in that as well. But regardless, it does seem that the organization is being remade. And this is likewise going to impact all the other issues and nonprofits that its budget was also helping along, because the money was not just going within it, it was going to other organizations. And of course, given that ESG was also a deeply partisan issue, well, the money also ended up having deeply partisan connotations. And this is even brought up on the information level. News outlets that receive some government funding are also facing a lot of scrutiny right now under allegations that they were using taxpayer money while being politically biased. They were helping one party and harming the other party. And it's even possible the Trump administration could cut their budgets because of this. NPR, one example of this, they're facing a lot of pressure on this front. Now, a couple of weeks ago, Elon Musk wrote on X, quote, it's a taxpayer-funded arm of the DNC. And he said that while pointing to a video of Catherine Maher, the CEO of NPR, testifying before Congress back in March. And she was being questioned by Representative Jim Jordan, a Republican from Ohio. Watch.
Is NPR biased?
Congressman, I have never seen any instance of political bias determining editorial decisions. No.
Well, Mr. Berliner, in his story last year, wrote, in the D.C. area, editorial positions at NPR, he said he found 87 registered Democrats, 0 Republicans. Is that accurate?
We do not track the numbers or the voter registration, but I find that concerning.
Award-winning journalist who worked 25 years at NPR, Mr. Berliner, was he lying when he wrote that?
I am not presuming such. I just we don't track that information about our journalists.
87 to 0, and you're not biased?
I think that is concerning if those numbers are accurate.
Now, Representative Jim Jordan, he continues on in that hearing, raising examples of their reporting, and he suggests based on their reporting, it is often painted along partisan lines. And he suggests, look, if your people are partisan, you're obviously only hiring people on one side of the political aisle, and your reporting is only on one side of the political aisle, how do you define being biased? Well, it seems kind of biased. That was the argument, right? But even aside from organizations like this, right, news outlets, nonprofits that were getting government money and that are now being re-examined for partisan reasons, there's also more to this. The Trump administration is now restricting taxpayer money, the money you pay every year, from going to organizations that are holding on to issues like DEI. That's diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this, of course, ties into two different issues. On one side with DEI, There's the accusation that the politics around it, ironically, represent a type of discrimination based on race or gender. For example, if there were requirements against hiring white people in a business, or if a program is only open to a certain gender, well, what do you call that? You would call that discrimination. And that would violate civil rights laws in the United States, even though it was not being enforced like that. So if a company is, by virtue of DEI, discriminating based on race, gender, or something else, then it was in violation of civil rights laws, and it could be sued or even possible face other charges. And the other side is that Trump signed an executive order recognizing only two genders. You're a man or you're a woman, there's nothing else. So any program that gets involved in trans politics, American tax dollars cannot be used for them. They can no longer spend your tax dollars to advance the idea there's more than two genders. And so like DEI overall, which represents these types of agendas, it's come into the crosshairs of the Trump administration. They're cutting the funding, or they're even going after some organizations. For example, FCC Chairman Brendan Carr recently announced he's launching an investigation into Disney and ABC. He said this is because of concerns that their alleged DEI policies could violate FCC prohibitions on, guess what? Discrimination. The anti-discrimination folks may have been engaging in illegal discrimination. Here's what he said in his open letter to the head of Disney. Brendan Carr, right here, his letter. He said, quote, "I am writing to inform you that I have asked the FCC's Enforcement Bureau to open an investigation into Disney and ABC. He says, in practice, I want to ensure that Disney and ABC have not been violating FCC equal employment opportunity regulations by promoting invidious forms of DEI discrimination. While I have seen reports that Disney recently walked back some of its DEI programs, significant concerns remain." And he adds, as you may know, the Communications Act and Commission rules prohibit regulated entities like Disney and ABC from discriminating on the basis of race, color, religion, national origin, age, or gender. And he's alleging they may have just been doing that. We're watching similar actions at the state level. One example of many is the investigations now being carried out in the Department of Education in California. Daily Signal said this. The U.S. Department of Education launched an investigation into the California Department of Education for alleged violations of the Family Educational Rights Privacy Act, FERPA, which President Gerald Ford signed in 1974. It says it gives parents the right to access their children's educational data. And the federal department suggests the CDE, meaning the California Department of Education, violated this law with guidance applying a new California law that prohibits school personnel from disclosing a child's gender identity to his or her parents. And so if the schools are grooming your kid to be trans and then making the kid tell the teachers or something else they're trans and then hiding that from the parent, they could be violating the law. The issue is California allowed that. They're now under investigation at the federal level. Now it says this, if the Department of Education finds the California Department of Education in violation of FERPA, it can terminate CDE's federal funding. The California Department of Education could lose its federal funding. Now it says this, the lawsuit included the CDE because it had dismissed a guidance document urging school districts to adopt anti-notification policies, meaning they don't want you telling your parents, right? It says parents harmed by the notification bans have also joined this lawsuit as plaintiffs in the case. Now, we're seeing similar issues like this in libraries as well. There are conservative groups that allege that some of the pro-LGBTQ plus so on programs, and also books that taxpayer-funded libraries have been holding are sexually explicit. There are children's books promoting incest and children's books promoting everything you can possibly imagine, or maybe things that you would never normally imagine. This was being shown to children. They were having trans book readings and so on. And especially some of these programs and books, these were aimed at children. Now, what do you call it when you're providing kids with sexually explicit material? Well, you call that illegal. And the Trump administration is likewise taking actions against some of the organizations tied in with the library systems, with this whole thing as the backdrop. USA Today said this: dozens of federal grants held by libraries, archives, and museums nationwide have been terminated mid-year, in some cases after the money was already spent, which is problematic because they have to give it back. It says the Institute for Museum and Library Services has ended many grants in its Laura Bush 21st Century Librarian Program and the National Leadership Grants Program, according to the American Library Association. It says these grants provide training for librarians and fund projects to innovate in the field. Innovate those libraries, right? What would that possibly mean? Now, it notes they are funded through reimbursement after they are completed, leaving institutions whose grants were abruptly terminated on the hook for the money they have already spent. It says on April 7th, the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees and the Almond Library Association sued to stop the Trump administration's efforts to gut the Institute of Museum and Library Services. It says the complaint argues that cutting IML's programs violates the law by eliminating programs Congress has provided funding for and directed IMLS to undertake. It says on April 10th, they requested a preliminary injunction preventing the Institute from cutting off the grants. Now, look, some of the pushback on that front alleges the funding cuts will impact a lot of other programs. It's kind of a shotgun blast. It's hitting everything in the center, but everything next to it. And it's not just the DEI and the gender stuff, right? But there's also a legal battle now going on there as well. And back to the bigger issue of how American tax dollars are being spent. Basically, it seems the Trump administration is cutting anything and just about everything related to DEI or ESG. Anything with this whole global warming initiative or race narratives or gender narratives, everything is being targeted now. And this also includes taxpayer money being sent to other countries. Now, there was a story recently of the United States ending funding for research programs at universities in Australia. In 2024 alone, it turned out the United States gave around $400 million in funding grants through the Australian Research Council. We were giving money to the Australian university system. And it's apparently been like that after just year after year. And losing the money had caused something of a national crisis in Australia over the budget for several universities because we were giving so much money to them that they're going to have trouble surviving without the money we were giving to them. And also, the money was cut on the grounds that, guess what? The universities were engaging in gender ideology programs like trans issues. And those issues now go against U.S. law. The U.S. government cannot give money to organizations that do it, given that Trump signed an executive order forbidding U.S. government involvement in all that trans identity stuff, right? Now, it's also not just Australia. It's also really not even just universities. Even businesses in other countries are being told they need to abide by U.S. laws on these fronts if the United States is going to work with them. No money unless you follow our laws. We're not forcing you to change it, but you're not going to get our money if you don't. Reuters said this: the Trump administration has ordered some French companies within U.S. government contracts to comply with his executive order banning diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. DEI, none of that. It says highlighting the extraterritorial reach of U.S. policies and their potential impact on European corporate practices. Now, the important context here that they're writing off in that statement is this only applies if we're giving money to them. It's not like we're forcing these countries to change their policies without money attached to it. This is, we're not going to pay you to do something that violates our laws. Do it if you want to, but you're not getting our money if you do it. Simple as that. It says the companies have been told to confirm their compliance in a questionnaire entitled Certification Regarding Compliance with Applicable Federal Anti-Discrimination Law. No money if you are violating this. It says Reuters has seen a copy of the questionnaire, And it says the questionnaire will also spark concerns in European boardrooms that the Trump administration is widening its fight against DEI policies overseas at a time when Trump's actions on tariffs and security ties have upended transatlantic relations. It says French business daily Les Echos, which first reported the U.S. demand late on Friday, said it had been sent out to firms by the U.S. Embassy in Paris. And they say, quote, "We inform you that Executive Order 14173, ending illegal discrimination and restoring merit-based opportunities," meaning if you got the skills, you got the job, and we're not going to look at your skin or your race or your religion or your gender or whatever else. And it was signed by President Trump and applies to all suppliers and service providers of the U.S. government, regardless of their nationality and the country in which they operate. Reads the letter, according to a copy that French newspaper Le Figaro republished on its website. Meaning, of course, if you're going against the values and the laws of this country, you do you, but we're not going to pay you to do it. And we're seeing this play out in other areas as well, including with trade and diplomacy. Because guess what? Among the big debates right now is between the United States and European countries on free speech. And we are seeing the United States demand free speech in Europe. Now, is that possible? I'll be talking about this more after we come back from a quick break.
Experts agree. One of the best ways to protect against financial uncertainty is to diversify your portfolio. Learn how physical gold and silver can secure your retirement funds from today's economic challenges with a gold IRA from American Hartford Gold. You can safeguard your wealth with no penalties or taxes when you transfer your current qualifying retirement accounts. Call now and our precious metals specialists will send you a free information kit, no cost or obligation. American Hartford Gold, a trusted industry leader with an A+ from the Better Business Bureau, has a 5-star rating from thousands of happy clients. Whether you are getting physical precious metals in a gold IRA or delivered to your doorstep, we offer only the highest quality gold and silver. For your peace of mind, we also offer a no-fee buyback commitment, a low price guarantee, along with free shipping and free insurance. So don't wait. Call the number on your screen today and secure your financial future.
Welcome back. There's a big debate happening right now between the United States and many countries in Europe over freedom of speech and lack thereof. Now, the European Union is threatening $1 billion fine, $1 billion against X and Elon Musk for allowing what it considers to be illegal speech. How dare you let people have freedom of speech? The United Kingdom, the UK, has also become a focus for its increasingly strict laws on censorship. And look, the issue of freedom of speech could play a role in U.S. relations with countries all throughout Europe, including on tariffs, including on trade deals, and including on diplomacy. If you want to work with us, you got to respect some basic human rights, freedom of speech being one of the most basic rights. Back in February, Vice President J.D. Vance, he criticized the UK Prime Minister during a meeting at the White House, saying there have been infringements on free speech in Britain that impact Americans. Watch this.
We do have, of course, a special relationship with our friends in the UK and also with some of our European allies, but we also know that there have been infringements on free speech that actually affect not just the British. Of course, what the British do in their own country is up to them, but also affect American technology companies and by extension American citizens.
Now, this isn't just coming from the White House either. The U.S. State Department is putting direct pressure on the UK, the United Kingdom, for its censorship laws. The Independent in the UK, they said this: the former top judge in the UK Supreme Court has accused the Trump administration of, quote, unjustifiable interference after pressure was exerted on the UK over free speech. It said Lord Sumpton's intervention came after the U.S. State Department made a rare intervention in British politics, warning of its concerns about freedom of expression in the United Kingdom. The department responsible for U.S. foreign policy, State Department, put a statement on X highlighting fears about the prosecution of anti-abortion campaigner Livia Tosi Bolt, who was praying silently outside of an abortion clinic, had a sign saying, basically, if you want to talk, come talk to me. She was arrested for that. It says the State Department alleged that Ms. Tosi Bolt faces criminal charges for offering conversation with patients seeking abortions within a legally prohibited buffer zone outside a clinic. They say, quote, "We are monitoring her case. It is important that the UK respect and protect freedom of expression." The State Department's dedicated democracy, human rights, and labor DRL account posted. And it added, quote, U.S.-UK relations share a mutual respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. However, as Vice President Vance has said, we are concerned about freedom of expression in the United Kingdom. And remember, while they say this is America interfering in the UK is threatening, or at least was threatening, to extradite and arrest American citizens for making comments online that violate British law. They're threatening to arrest and extradite U.S. citizens from the United States going to the UK to face criminal charges. Is that a violation of free speech? They're placing billions in fines on U.S. tech companies for violating their free speech laws, which are, again, censorship laws. And there have been also a lot of other cases like this. One example, there was the recent one. Police in the UK arrested parents for complaining about one of the schools on WhatsApp. How dare you criticize the school system? And there were many cases of people being charged for making racially charged comments online in the UK. A lot of it has to do with people criticizing the programs of mass migration. That can be illegal. For example, there was a British mom who was just sentenced to 2 years in prison, pulled away, separated from her daughter, separated from her family, for making an online tweet which she posted and then deleted 4 hours later. 2 years in prison. Now, her post was in response to a mass stabbing attack at a dance school for little girls. A bunch of, 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds, 8-year-olds. It was carried out by a man who was a British citizen, but his parents immigrated to the UK from Rwanda back in 2006. This guy murdered 3 little girls, seriously injured many others. Now, the British people, people are going to jail for criticizing him. And it's not just in the UK also. There are similar cases all throughout Europe. This is not just a UK thing. Criticize mass migration policies, criticize, basically a lot of things. You could go to jail. Speech in many forms is illegal there. Just recently, the chief editor of a right-wing Germany news outlet was sentenced to 7 months in prison for posting a meme. And the meme was an edited picture of the country's interior minister where she was artificially edited to be holding a sign that said, "I hate freedom of speech." He suggested that this individual hates freedom of speech and he's going to jail for 7 months because of that. Now look, back to the Trump administration though, there's a two-way battle going on the censorship front right now. On one side, European countries are pushing American tech platforms to censor in line with their laws. They're placing fines on U.S. companies, even threatening some of these companies that have no operations in those countries. You have free speech platforms in the United States that are not even, again, stationed, have no business in these European countries, and European countries are threatening to go after them, even sometimes threatening criminal charges. But on the other side, the Trump administration is pressuring countries all throughout Europe to drop their censorship policies. And this is both on grounds of diplomacy and even as a term of trade deals with tariffs, suggesting, of course, that the argument that European fines on American tech and social media companies, these are tariffs by other means. If they fine American tech companies $30 billion, which is about what they've done over the course of recent years, then yes, that is a type of tariff. And yes, that means when tariffs are calculated, that will be taken into account in terms of what the Trump administration puts on their goods. Now, folks, that said, let me know what you think about all this and this free speech issue. Should the United States push for free speech globally? Is it our business? Should we care about what the UK does? Does your country have free speech protection laws like the United States does? Well, leave a comment below. Let me know. Also, don't forget to hit the like button, and let's jump into some questions. Let's see here. First off, Cassandra Olympiade, you're saying Trump told countries not to retaliate, yet China did. So did Canada. What does this mean for Canada? Yeah, so it was kind of a bad image for Canada. Let's put it that way. So Trump enacted very broad tariffs, right? I mean, most countries in the world are facing 20%, 30%, and then China retaliated. They put like 84%, now 124% tariffs on American goods. Trump basically put everything else on pause while he goes to trade war with China. And I'll give you some more updates on that soon. The whole thing is kind of getting wild. Basically, here's what happened. Trump said that because China retaliated, we're going after them and they're the focus. He put everything else on hold. All other countries are facing 10% tariffs. Now there's some discrepancy over whether that it still includes like the additional tariffs on Mexico and Canada and China because of the whole fentanyl issue, which is about 20% tariffs. It seems that's the case, but we'll have to see what it means for Canada. If you look at the big board in terms of which countries retaliated, because Trump says the one that retaliated is the one it's going after right now, it's only China and Canada. And look, some other ones might have retaliated. The European Union, they were an inch away from it. They probably would have if you gave them another week. But it was a bad image for Canada. It's basically them and the CCP retaliating. Canada looks like it's kind of doubling down right now. It's not clear which direction they're going in. We'll have to see. It does not seem yet that Trump is going to go after them like he's going after the CCP. But for Canada, they don't have a lot of other places to sell their goods. That's the reality. Remember, the tariffs right now are not necessarily about, they're not necessarily about them being able to like buy stuff. It's one thing if you're trying to buy from people. It's another thing if you're trying to sell to people. Let me explain. If you're a guy and let's say you need 20 pairs of clothes, right? You need 20 pairs of clothes because you need to restock your wardrobe. You got rid of everything you need to go and buy. You go out and you go and tell a store, hey, I need to buy 20 pairs of clothes, and they charge you too high. And you're like, all right, I'm going to the next place. Well, it's in their interest to make a deal with you because you're the buyer. Now, you go to the next place, and there's plenty of other stores to go to. You're going to find probably a better deal because you can make them negotiate and haggle with you and so on. If you're a seller and you say, I need to sell you 20 pairs of clothes, what does that mean? Well, you go to one guy and he says, why would I need 20 pairs of clothes? I have all the clothes I need. I already have sources of clothes. Take a hike. Good luck trying to sell it. You go to the next guy. What do you mean sell 20 pieces of clothes? Who needs that? The guy who needed 20 pairs of clothes, that is the one who, again, you need to go to. It's very hard to find a buyer. It's very easy to find a seller. And that's the issue with Trump's tariffs right now. They're about sellers. They're about sellers, not buyers. Canada needs to sell, not buy. China needs to sell, not buy. Europe needs to sell, not buy. And so if they can't find markets, if they can't find people to buy, they're not going to be able to get around the tariffs. That's just the reality of it. America has the entire world to choose from. The only difficult point with that are things we can't get anywhere else, and that's where China is more complicated. For example, rare earth minerals are the big one. Pharmaceuticals are another big one. We became too reliant on them in a few key areas, and they got monopolies on those, and that's why the trade issue with China is so serious. But with Canada, not really. What do we buy from Canada? Timber. How many countries sell timber? Trump actually made some executive orders. We can now harvest more timber in the United States. We don't need them. Not much, at least. Oil, energy. All they're doing now is removing caps on American energy production, and we can basically not need Canada. What else do they have? We sent some of our factories there. We can manufacture in just about every country on Earth. We don't need Canada, especially because it costs a lot to manufacture there anyways. There's not a lot of interest They don't have any cards to play, and so they're in a very bad boat. China's another issue. They have a lot of monopolies, and the monopolies are the real tough part. But remember also what happened last week. Trump made an executive order on monopolies, and they're going to start going after companies that have monopolies or that use imbalanced trade practices to kind of push out competitors. That could mean it's a Chinese company that gets state funding, and U.S. companies can compete with them. They may face additional regulations. So I think that's one of the ways it's so different. See more buts, you're saying. So we have people being trained by leftists on how to be Marxist activists and stir up trouble, actual classes that teach them how to do this, but we don't have similar classes on how to be a capitalist. Strange, isn't it? Yeah, and that's one of the arguments, in the early part of this episode, I was going over some of the different organizations that get a huge amount of government money, and, they're effectively only on one side of the political spectrum. As far as I know, they're not giving money to train, kids on like Austrian economics. They're not giving money to kids to be trained on like, a pro-America view of history. They're teaching anti-Americanism. They're teaching transgenderism. They're teaching race politics. They're teaching Marxism, even directly and many times. Case in point, the BLM heads said literally on camera, quote, "We are trained Marxists." They said, "We are trained Marxists." And so, yeah, you have actual trained Marxists. And remember, behind some of those organizations were U.S. taxpayer-funded organizations doing training for them, giving money to them, working on community organizing for them. And that is one of the big concerns that's being raised by a lot of the Trump team right now, was effectively, look, you're going to hear two narratives politically. Democrats are saying that Trump is basically gutting the entire political system. They're not entirely wrong. Trump kind of is gutting the entire political system. He's gutting nonprofits. Some of the operations they do, you could argue, have some good to them. Is that a good thing, just to get rid of everything? Democrats have kind of walked back some of their statements. They're now acknowledging, okay, there was some funding that was not very good, but there was a lot that was good, and you're kind of getting rid of all of it, right? They're acknowledging that maybe some of this was unnecessary spending, like USAID, for example, right? Okay, we were spending money on some crazy stuff, but you're focusing on just the crazy stuff and ignoring the good stuff. And that's the argument from them. The Trump side basically is saying that there was what was effectively a global slush fund of far-left politics, that all the activist organizations, all the agitation organizations, all the groups that were funding protests and mass movements and re-education programs almost entirely on the left hand of politics was being funded by U.S. taxpayers. And they're saying, look, was the entire effective, left-wing establishment government funded? Was there a redirection where some politician said, we're going to use your tax dollars and finance programs that will politically, give us an advantage? And I mean, is that even legal? That's the argument, right? If you're manipulating the U.S. education system and teaching kids only one side of a political viewpoint, and that political viewpoint only helps the political party that put those laws in place, is that political indoctrination meant to help you win elections, where those kids are going to go to college and be of voting age, and you've educated them to only have a worldview for the political party that you're part of? Is that the manipulation of U.S. tax dollars to give you a political advantage? If you're spending billions and billions of dollars to finance grassroots organizations, and the grassroots organizations are only active on one side of the political spectrum and are even taught to hate and even attack, in some cases, people on the other side, does that mean that you're financing a grassroots operation to benefit yourself politically? From the conservative side and the Republican side, that's what this looks like. And so you're going to see two very different narratives depending on which media you're listening to, right? The idea of whether this was stuff that actually helped people or whether this was stuff basically using your tax dollars to rig the entire system politically to the advantage of one party. That it was a giant partisan slush fund. That's the argument, right? And I don't know, maybe the truth is somewhere in the middle. But I do think it is problematic if you're giving money to organizations that, again, are politically active and that are politically advantageous and harmful to one side and advantageous to the other. Normally you don't let tax dollars be used like that. It can even make you lose your 501c3, your nonprofit status if you do stuff like that. And so there are some legal grounds that they could use on this to justify cutting the funding and so on. Martin McKenzie, you're saying no more pandemic politics. Pandemics is the new gain-of-function tool of tyrants. Yeah, gain of political function, right? Gain of partisan function. So I'm half joking, but that was one of the arguments. Look, I believe COVID was real. I know people who died from it. I think it was a big deal. But of course, the argument was, as some suggested, never let a good crisis go to waste. There were some people who took advantage of the laws and the shutdowns and everything else to give themselves political advantage. If you're using pandemic policy to rewrite election laws, which they did even openly in 2020, then I would say that is manipulation of a crisis to give a political advantage, which should have been challenged stronger, I think. And that's the problem too. A lot of very tyrannical policies are enacted in times of crisis. And there are people who sometimes use crisis as a window to advantage themselves. If there's a crisis, they'll use the crisis to try to seize power. If there's a crisis, they'll try to use the crisis to change the laws to benefit themselves or harm their adversaries. When there's a crisis, things are being shaken up, and there are some people who view crisis through a selfish lens. I think it's terrible when people do that, but people do it. And so, and that has, I think, a negative impact as well, because it makes what are, I would say, for some people, good intentions turn into a corrupt endeavor. And so, look, I think a lot of people's entire perception of, the pandemic and pandemic response has been completely tainted because of the way some people manipulated the situation for their own interests. Whereas I do believe that there was, to an extent, some good intentions on some elements of that. And the issue is now, if we run into another crisis, I don't think people will tolerate most of the responses, even kind of good ones, because of the way it was manipulated last time, right? Yeah, James, you're saying, Josh, it appears you are entangling your observations with the wave function of the Democratic Party. Well, I try to show you all both sides of the argument, right? I mean, look, I think you all know I have my opinions on these things, but I do try to be balanced in terms of trying to understand where the other side is coming from. And so I will do my best to tell you that, although I'll tell you what the other side is saying as well. And I do think I often make I don't think I hide my opinions at all. But I do try to be balanced in it. One thing I do when I give my viewpoints on things is I try to imagine how I'd feel if someone I disagreed with were to do it. I'll give you an example of this. So, I don't know if y'all saw, but Bill Maher, he interviewed Steve Bannon recently, right? And so, Bill Maher, I don't know how to say his name. He basically pulls out a copy of the U.S. Constitution, and he questions Steve Bannon over the idea that Trump might try to run for a third term in office. And he reads, I believe it was the 22nd Amendment, where it says that a president can only be elected twice. You cannot run for a third term. And you know, he kind of jokes, tells Steve, hey, maybe you should hold on to this. Because Steve Bannon, you know, he's been kind of on the side of Trump, wanting to have Trump run for a third term. Now, I've been on Steve's show. I think he's a great guy. I know him personally. But, you know, this is one of the big debates right now. Now, I know, or Bill Maher, right? Now, I know the technicalities of this. The technicality is this. The 22nd Amendment, right, the 22nd Amendment, says you cannot be elected more than 2 times. But the loophole the Trump side is looking at to possibly run for a third term in office is there are ways to become president that bypass the normal election process. For example, if Trump runs as the vice president, the running mate of J.D. Vance or RFK Jr. or whoever else, and then whoever is elected then steps down, the vice president becomes president, and Trump would again become president. Meaning, it would still be within the law, but it's a loophole, right? Now, for me, I understand the technicality of the law they're discussing. I understand that there's a bit of intellectual dishonesty when it comes to the way that it's being presented by a lot of the left. They're not talking about overturning the 22nd Amendment. They're talking about a loophole within the law that specifically talks about whether or not you're elected. I can also understand where they're coming from, though, because I can put myself in the other person's shoes. All right, folks, level with me. Hey, imagine 2016, Hillary Clinton elected president, first woman president, Madame Presidente. She's the president of the United States, and you're in the Clinton administration yet again, right? Comes to an end, 8 years over, and they find a loophole that says she can run for a third term, and you know they're going to do it. Would you support that? Right? Would you support that? They say, well, it's not technically illegal. There's a loophole within the 22nd Amendment that would let me do it. Would you still support it? And so, you know, this is what I try to do, right? I do think I make my viewpoints clear, but I make an effort to understand the other side. And that's how I do. When I present to you both sides of things, that's me making an effort to do that. And I do think it's necessary to do that because it puts things in perspective. You know, and I will sometimes talk about things I don't even agree with. It's just, as a journalist, I believe that, journalists should do that, right? Otherwise, I think I'm being a hypocrite. I think I would be hypocritical were I to not do that, but especially when I'm criticizing sometimes other media for not doing that, right? Kenneth Harris, you're saying the vice president was right for asking, what are we defending? If the U.S. is defending the end of freedom of speech and religion there, why are we spending money for their defense? So yeah, so you're talking, I believe, about Vice President J.D. Vance when he criticized the UK Prime Minister in the Oval Office for censorship. Well, and that is one of the big points, right? Okay, folks, let's go back in time. America just won the American Revolution. We become a country. 1776. America now stands as a unique anomaly in the face of the planet. We represent the first form of government in a long time that does not have a king, right? We're kind of reviving. America basically, after the American Revolution, revived a system of government that ended with the rise of Julius Caesar. We went back to ancient Rome, and we brought back a political system that most of the world probably thought was dead. The idea of a republic, right? We brought back the republic. And that was a shot over the bow to every king and every tyrant on the face of the planet because it was a different form of government. Now that was an experiment. It was an experiment also, not even just on government form, but also in the rights of the individual. We also announced a Declaration of Independence, which introduced very radical ideas such as God-given rights and a clarification of the role of government. That government is created to defend what are God-given rights. Even the idea that slavery might be wrong was not a concept most of the world had, and the Declaration of Independence, criticize America as you will, the Declaration of Independence set forth the idea, the very concept, that maybe slavery was wrong. And that was a massive blow to basically the entire world, because that represented new ideas that were disruptive to the power and the nature of most governments at that time. Now, what did America do over the course of time? Well, eventually America became a very powerful country, huge, powerful economy all through the 1800s, especially like mid to late 1800s and early 1900s, powerhouse of global economy, the envy of the world, right? And then what happened? America, during that time, said, we will only do diplomacy. We will only work with countries that represent the same values as ours. We're not going to work with tyrants. We're not going to work with tyrannical regimes. And by effect, because everybody wanted to work with us, what happened? Almost every country in the world abandoned monarchy. Most countries became democracies or republics. And that was led by the changes America represented, because we used the tool of, hey, you want to work with us? There are some requirements. What you're watching America do right now is the same thing. It's the same thing. Because what had happened was this. Through the power of globalism, the entire world had become dominated not by monarchy, but really by socialism and communism. Now, we empowered socialist regimes all throughout the world. Most of Latin America has adopted socialist government. Canada has adopted many socialist principles. Most of Europe has gone deeply socialist. Some of our biggest trading partners, China, Vietnam, others, are outright communist, full-blown communist parties. And they represent values on human rights that go against everything we're supposed to represent. Slavery, literally, live organ harvesting, re-education through labor, torture, murder of religious dissidents, suppression of political speech, absolute suppression of speech in almost every regard. And policies like this have been adopted in many countries. Suppression of speech, the going after of religions, people daring to speak out on this stuff. And America, rather than standing up for the values we used to represent that changed the world, have instead basically bowed down and let it happen. We let these tyrants fine our companies. We let these tyrants impose their own restrictions on our companies. We don't do it back to them. We let them change our values, and we let them keep theirs. And what is now happening is that America says no more. If you want to trade with America, you need to adopt the same values on human rights that we have. If you are a tyrant, we will not support you. Maybe we will to an extent. Trump is still working with some communist countries. But for the most part, it does seem now that there are some strings attached to at least money from America. He's not forcing to change through trade. But if you want us to, as J.D. Vance suggested, pay for your military, pay for your defense, we need to make sure we're defending something that's in line with our values. We're not going to defend some corrupt socialist country. If you want to, get money from the U.S. government, whether it's grants or loans or research contracts at those Australian universities or those French businesses, you cannot enact policies that violate people's basic rights. That means no discrimination based on race, gender, religion, or otherwise. Meaning if you have DEI politics, we will not support you. You do not get our money. And if you're in the UK and you are, censoring people for mean things they say on the internet, well, look, you be you, fine and dandy, good chap, but we're not going to give you money if you do it, and we're not going to let you censor our companies either. And that's the argument right now. There are strings attached if you want to work with us. There are strings attached if you want our money. And what I do think is happening is that America is going back to basically the early 1900s or the late 1800s in terms of what we represented for the world. I really see Trump rolling back the clock. On that note, Trump seems to be obsessed with like the policies of the early 1900s. He's all about tariffs. He's all about like basically the monetary policies of post-Civil War and pre Federal Reserve policies, like 1905 type policies, right? Which most people don't even think about, like pre-income tax, right? Pre-income tax. Trump is obsessed with America during that time, and diplomatically, a lot of the stuff they're doing is what America was also doing at that time. It's actually kind of fascinating. It'd be a great analysis, actually, just to even go back and compare Trump's visions to like the politics of 1905, because he really seems to point very heavily to like that era in terms of what he wants for this country. It's really interesting. Another question here, TMA, you're saying, whoever would overthrow the liberty of a nation must begin by subduing the freedoms of speech. Benjamin Franklin. And I fully agree. And I'd say it's because ideas are the basis of everything. If you can control ideas, you can control everything that emerges from ideas. And what emerges from ideas? Innovation, social movements, who you vote for, what you like, what you don't like, your religion, your culture, every single thing. Everything stems from ideas. Control the ideas, you control everything. And I do believe that there's a certain innate recognition of truth that exists within people. And I do believe that if you show truth in its most accurate form, people will be able to differentiate between truth and lies. And so I do think people interested in suppressing societies are also interested in suppressing truth because they fear it. Truth is, I believe, the most powerful force in the world. Maybe right next to love and kindness, right? Truth is a very powerful force. And so any tyrannical regime will look to suppress and control truth, which is why I think you see these very aggressive policies in place to suppress it. That said, folks, happy Monday. I hope you had a good weekend. Join me tomorrow, 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time for another episode. In the meantime, don't forget to like this video. Do not forget to like this video. It helps us a lot on the algorithms and stuff. That said, I will see you tomorrow. As always, I enjoy it. And as always, please take care of yourselves, stay informed, and stay free. Thank you.